For more on what to expect from COP30 this week, let's turn to Susanna Hecht. She's a professor at the Luskin School of Public Affairs and the director of the Center for Brazilian Studies, both at the University of California, Los Angeles. Susanna, thank you for joining us. And first up, Brazil says forest protection is front and center. Is this a shift from previous narratives against fossil fuels?
I think it's quite a direct shift in narrative. It's important to remember that the last three COPs were at petrostates whose interests and forest cover were not really part of their strategy for dealing with climate change. Also, it's important to recognize that the science has shifted a lot since 2015, where in essence what we are seeing is that Amazonia itself has become a real climate tipping point. So tropical forests in general are really in the, as important targets. And it's important to remember that these forests are areas where human action can make a big difference in the short term. Just in a couple of years, deforestation dropped by 50% in Brazil. But things like the Thwaites glaciers and so on are not so vulnerable to human action. So this is why it's important. The other thing is, of course, that forests do more than one thing. They are biodiversity centers, they're inhabited areas, they're important for livelihoods. And this COP is very different in that it has a lot of indigenous and traditional peoples and, how shall we say, civil society groups whose livelihoods and so on are engaged with forests as being part of the audience and protagonists about these forests. So it's very different from previous times.
Susanna, if only about a third of countries have actually submitted updated climate targets, do you think COP30 is stalling?
Well, it's a really good question. And the issue a few weeks ago before I went to Brazil, I would have probably said, yeah, probably. But what we do see is that emissions are slowing down. It's important to recognize that we're in a moment of both a great deal of geopolitical instability, but also in a moment of technological change. So you can kind of imagine that we're in an equivalent moment between going from wood power into steam power and into other forms of energy. So in those moments, it's very difficult to make predictions. What is very important is that we are on the cusp of major technological changes and breakthroughs. And so that this means that perhaps what people were planning for was quite different. If you look at the change in things like renewables, all of a sudden you see that the EU is using many, many more renewables. Brazil is majorly involved in the questions of technological change right now, as of course is China. So there's a sort of general shift, in which case perhaps making predictions about what they are going to do might not be the right moment for doing this. Also, we're seeing a global energy realignment. So things are really in flux. And in that context, I think maybe people shouldn't be making too many predictions about what their energy dynamics would have been. In 2015, you wouldn't have seen people, Britain saying 50% of our energy will be coming from renewables.
Susanna, do you think delegates can actually negotiate climate action that countries will abide by starting Monday?
It's an interesting question. Remember that the COPs are a consensus dynamic, so everybody has to agree. There's no real sanctions for not abiding. So what that means is that free riders, you can go along without actually having to agree to what you've said, and that's sort of been the pattern that we've seen. It's part of the more general problem of collective actions in general. But in the conditions of a polycrisis, and I think that there's no country on the planet that's not experiencing some kinds of climatic stresses, and I'm talking to you from Los Angeles, one of the richest cities in the richest state, in the richest country, which had major fires blow through it and devastate neighborhoods. And the United States, for example, has had lots of burned up cities of late. So one of the things is, while we've been thinking about climate in a sort of abstract way as perhaps things that happen elsewhere, in fact, it's right at the heart of every nation state right now, because Spain is undergoing flooding, the Mediterranean area is aflame. There's constant environmental news associated with climate change.
Yeah.
So I think not only are we in a technological moment that's very interesting and unstable, but also we're at a moment in which the implications of climate change and even estimates of its costs, which are at about 1.4 trillion a year, which is a massive underestimate, make the questions more trenchant. And I think it's why perhaps people will be paying more attention and thinking more about how they can adapt to these things, and also more collaboration may be absolutely necessary.
Susanna Hecht, thank you so much for your time and insights. Great having you.
Thank you.